My parents thought it would be good for me. I was 11, shy, and spent too much time indoors with books and video games. Camp Whispering Pines was supposed to change that. 3 weeks in the Montana wilderness, learning outdoor skills and making friends. The camp sat in a valley surrounded by dense pine forests, with a lake at the center and cabins scattered around the shoreline like wooden teeth. The place had been operating since the 1960s, and everything showed its age. The docks sagged into the water, the flagpole leaned at an angle, and most of the cabin screens had holes that let in mosquitoes and worse things. I was assigned to Cabin 7 with 5 other boys. Our counselor was a man named Rick Thorne, and from the moment I met him, something felt off. He was maybe 30, tall and lanky, with prematurely gray hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to see too much. The other counselors were college kids, 19 or 20, but Rick had been there for years. He knew every trail, every hiding spot, every secret the camp held. The first week was normal enough. We hiked, swam, made friendship bracelets, and sat around campfires, roasting marshmallows. Rick was attentive, almost too much so. He remembered everything about us. My fear of deep water, Tommy's allergy to bee stings, Marcus's nightmares about his parents' divorce. He collected these details like souvenirs. He was always watching. During meals, I'd catch him staring at our table from across the mess hall. During free time, he'd appear wherever we were, claiming he was just checking on us. He had this way of putting his hand on your shoulder when he talked to you, fingers pressing a little too hard, staying a little too long. The other boys seemed to like him. He let us stay up past lights out, sneak extra snacks from the kitchen, and skip the mandatory nature walks if we wanted to rest. He made us feel special, chosen. But there were rules too, strange ones. We weren't allowed to talk about our families during certain activities. We had to participate in his special evening circles, where he'd light candles and have us share our deepest fears and secrets. He called it team building, but it felt more like confession, and we were never, ever supposed to go near the old ranger station on the far side of the lake. The ranger station had been abandoned since the 1980s, when the camp expanded and built new facilities. It was a small log building, half hidden by overgrown brush and leaning trees. Rick told us it was dangerous, full of rotting wood and rusty nails. But I could see it from my bunk window, and sometimes at night, I swore I saw a faint light moving inside. Tommy was the first to break. He was the youngest in our cabin, barely 10, with freckles and a gap-toothed smile. His parents had sent him to camp after a difficult year at school. He was homesick from day one, crying into his pillow when he thought we were asleep. Rick paid special attention to Tommy. Extra encouragement during activities, private talks by the lakeshore. Little gifts like smooth stones or interesting feathers. Tommy started to brighten up, following Rick around like a lost puppy. The rest of us were almost jealous. Then Tommy started changing. He became secretive, whispering to himself during the day and waking up screaming at night. When we asked what was wrong, he'd just stare at us with wide, frightened eyes and say Rick was teaching him important things we weren't ready to understand. The second week, Marcus went missing for 3 hours. We'd been on a nature hike, and when we stopped for lunch, Marcus was just gone. Rick organized a search party, playing the concerned counselor perfectly. We found Marcus sitting by a stream 2 miles from the trail, soaking wet and shivering. He couldn't explain how he'd gotten there. He remembered following Rick into the woods to look for a rare bird, and then nothing until he woke up in the water. Rick said Marcus must have gotten turned around and fallen into the stream. Heat exhaustion, he suggested. It happens all the time. But Marcus was different after that. Quiet, jumpy. He stopped participating in Rick's evening circles, and when pressed, he'd just shake his head and mumble about forgetting things being better sometimes. The third week, Rick announced a special overnight camping trip for our cabin. Just us and him, hiking to a remote site deeper in the wilderness. The other counselors seemed surprised by this plan, but Rick assured them he had permission from the camp director. It would be educational, he said, a chance for us to really connect with nature. We hiked for hours through increasingly dense forest, following trails that seemed to exist only in Rick's mind. The trees grew thicker, blocking out most of the sunlight, and the air became heavy and still. Strange sounds echoed from the shadows. Not animal sounds, but something else. something that made the hair on my arms stand up. Our campsite was in a small clearing surrounded by ancient pines. In the center sat a ring of blackened stones, clearly used for fires many times before. But the strange thing was how perfect the circle was, how precisely the stones were placed. It looked less like a fire pit and more like an altar. Rick seemed more excited than I'd ever seen him. He bustled around setting up camp, humming under his breath and shooting us strange, anticipatory glances. As evening approached, he gathered firewood while we pitched our small tents around the clearing's edge. The fire he built was enormous, much larger than necessary for cooking or warmth. The flames leaped high into the darkening sky, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the light. Rick sat cross-legged beside it, pulling out his usual supplies for our evening circle. But tonight there were new additions. A leather-bound book with symbols carved into the cover, a collection of smooth black stones arranged in specific patterns, and a knife, old and ornate, with a handle that seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. We sat in our usual circle, but everything felt different. Wrong. The forest around us had gone completely silent. No insects, no birds, no wind in the trees, just the crackling of the fire and Rick's voice, lower and more hypnotic than usual. He started with his normal questions, our fears, our secrets, our deepest shame. But tonight he pushed harder, demanding more intimate details. Tommy began crying silently, tears reflecting the firelight as Rick's questions became more invasive, more personal. Then Rick opened the book and began to read. The words weren't English or any language I recognized. They felt heavy in the air, like physical things pressing down on us. The fire seemed to respond to his voice, flaring higher with certain syllables, dimming to almost nothing with others. The black stones began to glow, not reflect the firelight, but generate their own cold illumination that hurt to look at directly. One by one, we tried to stand, to back away, but found ourselves frozen in place. Not paralyzed exactly, but unable to move against some invisible force that held us in the circle. Rick's voice grew louder, more urgent. He picked up the knife and held it above his head, and I realized with growing horror that this wasn't just some weird ceremony. This was something much worse, something that required more than just our fear and secrets. That's when Tommy screamed. Not a normal scream of fear or pain, but something primal and desperate that seemed to tear through the unnatural silence like a physical force. The spell, or whatever was holding us, shattered. We all lurched to our feet and ran. We crashed through the forest in complete darkness, branches tearing at our clothes and faces. Behind us, Rick's voice roared with rage, no longer even sounding human. The fire blazed so bright it turned the trees orange, and I could hear him crashing through the underbrush after us. We ran for hours, or maybe minutes. Time felt broken, stretched, and compressed like we were moving through a nightmare. Eventually, we stumbled onto a real trail and followed it back toward camp, arriving just as the sun was rising. The other counselors found us collapsed outside the mess hall, cuts and bruises covering our arms and legs, our clothes torn to shreds. We tried to tell them what happened, but our story kept changing. Details that had seemed crystal clear in the darkness became fuzzy and impossible to explain in daylight. Rick never returned to camp. His official story was that we'd gotten lost in the night, and he'd stayed behind to maintain the fire as a signal beacon while we found our way back. He would hike out later that morning, he told the search party over radio, but he never did. They found his campsite 3 days later. The fire pit was cold, surrounded by those same black stones arranged in that perfect circle. His gear was scattered around the clearing, but there was no sign of Rick himself. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead. Wild animal attack, most likely. Tommy never spoke about that night. His parents picked him up the next day and he left camp without saying goodbye to any of us. I heard later that he'd spent several months in therapy, but the details were kept private. Marcus seemed to recover quickly, at least on the surface, but for years afterward, he refused to go camping or even sleep outdoors. He'd get panic attacks at the smell of wood smoke. I tried to put it behind me to convince myself it had been some kind of psychological episode brought on by stress and suggestion. But the memories never faded. They became sharper, more detailed with time, as if whatever had happened that night was still happening somewhere in my mind. In 2018, I was driving through Montana for work and decided to take a detour past the old camp. Whispering Pines had closed in 2009 after a series of incidents and liability issues. The cabins were still there, but boarded up and covered in graffiti. The dock had finally collapsed into the lake. I parked and walked around for a while, surprised by how small everything looked. The dining hall where we'd eaten every meal was tiny. The lake that had seemed so vast was just a pond. Even the forest, which had loomed so large in my childhood memories, felt manageable and normal. But when I looked across the water toward where the old ranger station used to be, my skin began to crawl. The building was gone, long since collapsed or demolished. But the spot where it had stood felt wrong, like a scar on the landscape that hadn't healed properly. That night, in my hotel room 2 towns away, I searched online for any information about Rick Thorne. I found almost nothing. No social media profiles, no employment records, no trace of him before or after Camp Whispering Pines. It was as if he'd never existed at all. But I did find something else. A local news article from 1987 about a missing Boy Scout troop that had disappeared during a camping trip in the same forest. 3 boys, ages 9 to 12, along with their adult leader. They were found a week later, alive but traumatized, telling stories about strange rituals and a man who could speak to darkness itself. The adult leader was never found. The description of him in the article could have been Rick Thorne, 30 years younger. I've spent the last few years digging deeper, following threads that lead to more disappearances, more stories of camping trips that went wrong, more reports of a counselor or guide who vanished when things turned dark. The details change, but the pattern is always the same. Children taken to remote places. Ceremonies involving fire and stones and words that shouldn't be spoken. And always, someone who escapes to tell a story that no one quite believes. Last month, I got a message through social media from someone I didn't recognize. It was just a photo, taken at what looked like a modern summer camp. Kids sitting around a campfire, roasting marshmallows and laughing. Normal, innocent, safe. Except, standing behind them, barely visible in the shadows beyond the firelight, was a tall, thin figure with pale eyes and prematurely gray hair. The message had no text, just that photo, but I knew what it meant. He's still out there, still teaching children about fear and secrets and the kind of darkness that lives in remote places where no one can hear you scream. Still looking for the perfect circle, the perfect night, the perfect sacrifice to whatever he serves. I've tried to warn people, to contact the authorities, to do something useful with what I know. But who believes stories like this? Who takes action based on the traumatic memories of children and the ramblings of adults who can't let go of their nightmares? All I can do is remember and watch and hope that somewhere, in some forest camp or wilderness retreat, a group of kids will be brave enough to run when the fire burns too bright and the counselor's smile becomes something hungry and wrong. Because the thing about darkness is that it's patient. It can wait decades for the right moment, the right place, the right group of vulnerable children who just want to belong to something. And there are always more camps, always more counselors, always more fires burning in circles of black stone, waiting for someone foolish enough to believe that the wilderness is empty of everything, but trees and animals and clean mountain air. The forest remembers, and it's always hungry. I arrived at the park around 4 p.m. on a Tuesday. The ranger station was almost empty, just one older guy working the desk. When I asked about the best spots for solo camping, he recommended Trail Site 15, which was about 2 miles in from the main road. He said it was secluded, had a nice view of the valley, and most people preferred the sites closer to the parking area. Perfect, I thought. Just what I needed. The hike-in was beautiful. Fall colors were just starting to show, and the air had that crisp feeling that makes you want to stay outside forever. I found Site 15 exactly where the map showed it would be. It was a decent-sized clearing surrounded by thick pine trees, with a fire ring and a wooden picnic table. The nearest site was probably a quarter mile away through the woods. I set up my tent and got a fire going before sunset. Made some dinner, opened a beer, and just sat there enjoying the quiet. No cell service, no notifications, just the sounds of the forest. It was exactly what I had hoped for. Around 9 p.m., as it was getting properly dark, I heard some rustling in the trees behind my campsite. Nothing unusual, probably just a deer or raccoon. I kept reading my book by the firelight and did not think much of it, but then I heard it again. Same direction, but closer. I looked up from my book and peered into the darkness beyond the fire's glow. The rustling had stopped, but I had this strange feeling that something was watching me. You know that feeling when the hair on your neck stands up for no apparent reason? That is what it was like. I called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" No response, just silence. I went back to reading, but I could not shake the feeling. Every few minutes, I would look up and scan the tree line. The fire was bright enough to light up my immediate area, but everything beyond that was just black. Around 10:30, I heard footsteps. Not the random sounds of an animal moving through the underbrush. These were deliberate, measured steps. Someone was walking slowly around the perimeter of my campsite, staying just outside the circle of light from my fire. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight. "Hey, is someone out there?" I called louder this time. The footsteps stopped immediately. I clicked on the flashlight and swept it across the trees. Nothing, just pine branches and shadows. But I could feel it now, that sensation of being watched. It was so strong, it made my skin crawl. I decided to call it a night. I banked the fire, hung my food in the bear box, and climbed into my tent. I left the rain fly partially open so I could see out, and kept the flashlight next to my sleeping bag. That is when I saw the light. It was dim, like someone holding a small flashlight or maybe a phone screen. It appeared between the trees on the far side of my campsite, maybe 30 yards away. It would stay in one spot for a few minutes, then disappear, then reappear somewhere else. Always keeping that same distance, always pointed in my direction. I lay there for over an hour, watching this light move around my campsite in a slow circle. Whoever it was, they were patient. They never came closer, never made any noise. They just kept that steady, silent vigil. I barely slept that night. Every time I started to doze off, I would hear something. Twigs breaking, leaves rustling, the quiet scrape of something being dragged across the ground, and always that feeling of being watched. When morning came, I unzipped my tent and looked around. The first thing I noticed was a line of footprints in the soft dirt near the fire ring. Boot prints, probably size 10 or 11. They formed a perfect circle around my campsite, staying just at the edge of where the firelight would have reached. But that was not the worst part. On the picnic table, someone had left a small pile of items. My items. A granola bar from my backpack, my camp cup, a spare pair of socks. Things that had been in my tent with me while I slept. I checked my tent. The zipper was still zipped, no tears or damage. But somehow, someone had gotten inside and taken these things without waking me up. The thought of someone creeping around in my tent while I slept made me feel sick. I packed up quickly and hiked back to the ranger station. The same guy was working, and when I told him what happened, his expression changed completely. "Site 15?" he asked. "Someone was watching you?" "You know about this?" I said. He looked uncomfortable. "We have had a few reports over the past couple months. Solo campers, mostly. Someone watching them from the woods, moving their stuff around. One person said they woke up and found their boots arranged in a neat line outside their tent." "Why did you not tell me this yesterday?" I asked. "Because it is just reports," he said. "We have increased patrols, but we have never actually caught anyone. And we cannot close the whole park based on what might just be pranks." "Pranks?" I said. "Someone was in my tent while I slept." He nodded grimly. "File a report with the local police if you want. But between you and me, I would not recommend solo camping here until we figure out what is going on." I asked if he had any idea who it might be. He hesitated, then said, "There was a guy who used to work for the Park Service, got fired a few years back for inappropriate behavior toward female campers. The guy knew the trails better than anyone and had been seen in the area recently, even though he was banned from park property. His name is Dale Morrison," the ranger said. "Lives somewhere up in the hills. We have called the police about him before, but unless we catch him actually doing something illegal, there is not much they can do. I filed a police report, but I got the same response. Without evidence of an actual crime, they could not do much. Trespassing, maybe, but they would have to catch him first. I have not been back to Pine Ridge since then. I looked up Dale Morrison online, found a few old articles about his firing. Apparently, he had been following female campers, taking pictures of them without permission, going through their belongings when they went on day hikes. The kind of behavior that would get you fired, but not necessarily arrested. What bothers me most is not knowing what he wanted or how long he had been watching me before I noticed. The thought that someone could move around my campsite for hours, even get inside my tent without me knowing about it. It makes you realize how vulnerable you are out there. I still go camping, but never alone anymore. And I always bring extra locks for my tent, even though I know they would not really stop someone who was determined. Sometimes I wonder how many other people have had the same experience at Pine Ridge. How many solo campers have come back with stories about feeling watched, about finding their belongings moved around, about someone circling their campsite in the dark. The Park Service probably does not want those stories getting out. Bad for business. But if you are planning a solo trip to Pine Ridge State Park, especially to one of the remote sites, you should know. You might not be as alone as you think.